The rain that afternoon was a peculiarly English kind of torment, a dense, chilling drizzle that had persisted since dawn, smothering London in a blanket of damp grayness that seeped into the very bones of the city and the souls of its inhabitants, turning the bustling thoroughfares into quagmires of mud and refuse and driving all but the most desperate or determined indoors. A weather that perfectly mirrored the internal state of a man named Alastair Finch as he hurried, head bowed and shoulders hunched against the pervasive wet, through the labyrinthine, shadow-cloaked alleyways that snaked behind the grand, imposing edifices of government power, his heart a frantic, hammering drum against his ribs, each beat a painful echo of the terrifying, world-altering secret he now carried, a secret that felt like a physical weight, a searing brand hidden within the inner pocket of his worn, serviceable coat. A simple garment now transformed into a vault for a document that could, if he could somehow miraculously shepherd it across an ocean and into the right hands, stop a war before it truly began, wreck the destiny of nations, and save countless thousands of lives from the unthinkable carnage of battlefield and disease, a document a mere clerk of insignificant station and quiet disposition within the vast, grinding machinery of the British Colonial Office, had never been meant to lay eyes upon, a man whose entire existence was a monument to meticulous order and quiet obedience, whose life was measured in neatly inked lines and ledgers, the crisp rustle of official parchment, and the steady, predictable rhythm of the bureaucratic clock, a man who asked for little more than the comfort of routine, the small satisfaction of a task completed without error, and the warmth of a single candle in his modest rented room. A man who now found himself catapulted from that life of quiet obscurity into the very center of a maelstrom of geopolitical intrigue, his hands trembling not from the autumn chill but from the sheer, paralyzing magnitude of what he had accidentally discovered, the document in question being a personal, confidential, and astonishingly conciliatory letter from the highest levels of the British government, penned by the Earl of Dartmouth himself, the Secretary of State for the Colonies. Addressed with a tone of almost pleading reasonableness to the President of the Second Continental Congress assembling in Philadelphia, a message that stood in stark, shocking opposition to the public, bellicose proclamations of King and Parliament, a letter that offered not threats and ultimatums but profound apologies for past misunderstandings, promises of immediate and serious redress for every grievance the American colonists had ever voiced, from the hated Stamp Act and the tax on tea to the contentious quartering of soldiers. A proposed full and complete ceasefire, and an invitation to send delegates to London for negotiations, based on mutual respect and a new, more equitable vision of their future together within the Empire, an offer so generous, so unexpectedly empathetic and far-reaching, that Alastair, who had read and reread its contents with mounting disbelief in the locked silence of a records closet, knew with absolute certainty that if this genuine olive branch were to be received by the revolutionary leaders like the reasoned John Dickinson or the passionate Patrick Henry, it would utterly undermine the arguments of the firebrands like Samuel Adams who were pushing for a complete and violent break. It would empower the voices of moderation and reconciliation, and it would almost certainly halt the steady, seemingly inexorable march toward a declaration of independence and the bloody war that would inevitably follow, effectively strangling the American Revolution in its cradle. A prospect that should have filled him, a loyal subject of the crown, with patriotic relief, but instead filled him with a cold, creeping horror because he had also seen the truth, the cynical, duplicitous reality behind the beautiful, peace-promising words, a truth contained in a single line of hastily scrawled script in the margin of the draft copy, a note in the hand of a senior undersecretary that laid bare the monstrous gambit, file under Pax Americana. Hold until military preparations are complete and the first victories are secured. The King's wish is for a demonstration of overwhelming force, not negotiation. This is for posterity's record, not for their eyes. And those words, a demonstration of overwhelming force, had frozen the very blood in Alastair's veins, painting a vivid and terrifying picture of red-coated regiments marching through peaceful towns, of naval broadsides reducing harbors to splinters, of farms burned and families torn apart. All while the colonists labored under the tragic illusion that their sovereign was still open to reason, that a peaceful path remained, an illusion meticulously crafted by this very letter, which was never, ever intended to be sent, but was instead designed to be discovered later in the official archives, a piece of deliberate, historical propaganda to prove to future generations that the King had been magnanimous and willing to talk, that the stubborn, unreasonable Americans had forced a war upon a patient and benevolent empire, a lie so vast, so coldly calculated, that it made Alistair physically ill, and in that moment of nauseous clarity, faced with the choice between his sworn duty to the crown and the deafening cry of his own conscience, he had made his decision, a decision that marked him for treason, a crime punishable by a public and agonizing death by hanging, drawing, and quartering, and so he had acted, his movements calm and precise despite the terror screaming in his mind. He had carefully forged an entry in the outgoing dispatch log. He had smudged the official wax seal just enough to claim a flaw and request a replacement, a process that would buy him perhaps a day, and he had slipped the original, devastatingly honest letter into the concealed inner pocket of his coat, leaving behind a perfect, empty replica in the file, and now he was out in the rain-swept city, a fugitive, in his own home, a man possessed by a mission he had no idea how to accomplish, his mind a frantic whirlwind of impossible questions. How does a London clerk with no connections to the world of espionage or smuggling contact revolutionaries an ocean away? How does he trust anyone with a secret of this magnitude? How does he get the letter onto a ship bound for the colonies with every customs official and port authority likely already being quietly alerted to watch for any irregular communications? How does he, Alistair Finch, a man who knew the geography of filing cabinets, but not of covert operations, achieve this monumental task, the weight of it all pressing down on him, making each breath a struggle, every shadow a potential agent of the King's Secret Service, every glance from a stranger a possible threat, his paranoia a live wire sparking under his skin as he moved through the gathering gloom of the evening, the gas lamps beginning to sputter to life, their feeble yellow glow doing little to push back the oppressive darkness. His feet carrying him, almost instinctively, toward the only place he could think of that offered a semblance of anonymity, and a chance to gather his shattered thoughts. A noisy, crowded tavern near the docks called the Rusty Anchor, a place frequented by sailors and merchants, where a solitary man nursing a drink could become invisible, and he pushed open the heavy, scarred wooden door, the wave of sound and thick, warm air hitting him like a physical force, the smell of cheap tobacco, spilled beer, roasting meat, and unwashed bodies a stark contrast to the sterile scent of ink and paper that had defined his life, and he found a small, rickety table in the farthest, darkest corner of the raucous room, his back gratefully against the damp stone wall, his eyes scanning the crowd not with curiosity but with a raw, hunted fear, taking in the boisterous groups of off-duty sailors laughing too loudly, the huddled figures conducting furtive business in shadowy booths, the weary barmaids weaving through the chaos with practiced ease, and the solitary figures, like himself, who seemed to be hiding in plain sight, and he ordered a tankard of ale he had no intention of drinking, simply to have something to hold on to steady his violently trembling hands, the rough clay cool against his skin, and he sat there for what felt like an eternity, trying to formulate a plan, any plan, his mind circling uselessly around the immense, ocean-sized problem before him, the letter in his pocket feeling less like paper and more like a burning coal, a radioactive core of truth that threatened to consume him. And just as he was beginning to despair, to feel the utter hopelessness of his situation crush down upon him, a figure detached itself from the shadows near the bar, a man of average height but with a quiet, deliberate presence that seemed to part the crowd without effort, dressed in clothes that were too fine for this establishment, a well-tailored coat of dark wool, his boots clean despite the filth of the streets outside, and this man moved with an unnerving purpose, his path unerring, his gaze fixed not on Alistair's face, but on the hand he had subconsciously pressed against his chest, over the hidden pocket, and the man did not break his stride until he was standing directly beside Alistair's small table, his shadow falling over the untouched tankard of ale, and he leaned down, his voice a low, calm, and utterly terrifying murmur that cut through the tavern's din as cleanly as a razor, his breath smelling faintly of mint, and he spoke words that turned Alistair's blood to ice. "A foul evening for a walk, Mr. Finch, truly foul, though not nearly as foul as the weather awaiting a ship crossing the Atlantic this time of year, don't you think? Or perhaps we should discuss something else, something you found today, something that doesn't belong to you, something that needs to find its way home, and I believe I can help you with that." Alistair Finch's world, which had already been shrinking to the frantic beat of his own heart and the feel of the damning parchment against his chest, collapsed entirely in that moment, compressing into the space between his small, sticky table and the unnervingly calm man now occupying the opposite stool. The raucous noise of the rusty anchor, the clatter of tankards, the boisterous sea shanties, the raucous laughter, fading into a distant, muffled roar, as if he were suddenly submerged in deep, cold water, his every sense hyper-focused on the sharp-featured stranger whose eyes, a pale, disconcerting gray, held not a threat, but a knowing assessment, a cool calculation that was somehow more terrifying than outright menace, and for a long, agonizing second, Alistair's mind went utterly blank, wiped clean by a pure, undiluted panic, every instinct screaming at him to deny, to flee, to cry out. But his body remained frozen, a statue of terror, his hands still glued to the spot on his coat where the letter lay, a gesture that had now unequivocally betrayed him, and he could only stare, his mouth slightly agape, as the man smoothly appropriated a half-finished tankard from a neighboring vacant table, taking a slow, deliberate sip as if they were old acquaintances meeting for a casual pint, his gaze never leaving Alistair's, and when he spoke again, his voice was still that low, intimate murmur, designed to travel no further than Alistair's ears, each word precise and laden with unspoken meaning. "You seem surprised, Mr. Finch, though I can't imagine why. A man in your position, with access to the most sensitive correspondence in the Empire, must be accustomed to handling delicate matters, though perhaps not usually of this particular weight." He paused, letting the implication hang in the smoky air between them. "The rain today was quite persistent, wasn't it? Made the streets a mess. Easy for things to get lost. Or found." Alistair's mind, kick-started by this bizarre, coded small talk, began to churn again, not with clarity, but with a whirlwind of terrifying possibilities. Who was this man? He was clearly not a royal constable. They would have already clapped him in irons and dragged him away without a word. He was not military. His bearing was too subtle, too contained. This was something else, something from the shadowy world of intelligence, a realm Alistair had only heard whispered about in the corridors of power, a world of spies and double agents and whispered secrets in dark corners, and the man's mention of the Atlantic crossing, his offer of help, suggested allegiances that were terrifyingly ambiguous, and the most frightening question of all screamed in Alistair's mind. How had he been found so quickly? He had been so careful, he had told no one, he had spoken to no one, he had merely taken the letter and walked out, his heart in his throat, believing his crime to be a silent, invisible one, yet this man, this ghost, had tracked him to this specific tavern, had identified him by name, and knew the exact nature of what he had taken, a realization that made the walls of the tavern feel like they were closing in. A trap sprung with silent, efficient precision. I don't know what you're talking about." Alistair finally managed to stammer out, the words sounding weak and pathetic even to his own ears, a transparent lie that earned him a faint, almost imperceptible smile from the stranger, a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Of course you don't," the man said smoothly, placing his tankard down with a soft click. "Let us then speak hypothetically, a little game for a wet evening. Let us imagine a humble clerk, a good man, a loyal man, who stumbles upon a truth so ugly, so contrary to everything he believes about his king and country, that his conscience will not allow him to simply look away. Let us imagine this clerk makes a choice, a brave choice, some might say a foolish one, and takes it upon himself to correct a grave injustice. A noble impulse, truly. But this hypothetical clerk, for all his good intentions, is a novice in a game played by masters. He does not know the players, he does not know the rules, and he has no concept of the board upon which this game is being played, a board that stretches from the palaces of London to the meeting halls of Philadelphia. He believes he is acting alone, in secret, but he is mistaken. His every move, from the moment his fingers touch that particular piece of paper, has been observed." The man leaned forward slightly, and Alistair caught the faint scent of sandalwood and something metallic, like cold steel. "He is now the most interesting piece on that board, and both sides are moving to claim him. The king's men, the ones who wrote that hypothetical letter, they already know it is missing. They are not fools. They have a list of perhaps 5 men with the access and opportunity to have taken it. By tomorrow morning, maybe sooner, they will have narrowed that list to one. And their methods of inquiry are not gentle. A cold dread, sharper than any he had felt before, gripped Alistair's heart. The man was not just informing him, he was outlining his imminent demise. The other side, the stranger continued, his voice dropping even lower. The interested parties across the ocean, they would value such a document beyond measure. It would be a weapon more powerful than any cannon. But they have no way of knowing it exists, and no way to retrieve it. They have agents here, of course, but they are watched, their networks infiltrated. A man walking into a known Patriot tavern with that document would be in the hands of the Crown's interrogators before he could finish his first patriotic toast. He paused, letting the hopelessness of Alistair's hypothetical situation sink in. So, our hypothetical clerk is trapped. He is a dead man if he stays, and a dead man if he tries to run in any conventional way. He possesses a key that can unlock a cage of war, but he has no idea where the lock is, and he is surrounded by wolves who want the key for themselves, to melt it down and erase its very existence. The grey eyes fixed on Alistair with unnerving intensity. Now, cease the pretense. My name is not important. You may call me Mr. Sterling. I represent a third party. We have no love for the current administration's duplicity, nor do we have any particular affection for colonial rebellion. We are interested in balance, in preventing a needless, bloody conflict that would bleed the empire dry and enrich only the merchants of death and the bankers of despair. That document in your pocket is the only thing that can achieve that balance. It must reach Philadelphia, intact and verifiable. And I am the only person in this city, perhaps in this entire country, who can get it there. But I need you. The document must be seen to have come from a source within the bureaucracy, not from the shadow world. It must retain its authenticity. Your role is not over, Mr. Finch. It has only just begun. You must trust me, now, completely, or you will be dead before the clock strikes the hour. Nod if you understand the gravity of your situation, not as a hypothesis, but as your new and only reality. The offer, the confession, the terrifyingly detailed assessment of his predicament, all delivered in that same calm, analytical tone, left Alistair breathless. This was not a rescue. It was a conscription. He was being drafted from his life of quiet order into a world of shadows and mortal danger by a man who knew everything. He looked into Mr. Sterling's impassive face, seeing no reassurance, only stark, unvarnished truth. His choices had evaporated the moment he'd taken the letter. There was no going back to his desk, to his ledgers, to his quiet room. There was only forward, into the terrifying unknown with this mysterious guide. His hand, still pressed against his chest, felt the parchment crackle, a tiny sound screaming with the potential for peace or a death sentence. He took a shallow, ragged breath, and gave a single, tremulous nod. Mr. Sterling's lips twitched in something that was not quite a smile. Good. Finish your ale. You'll need your strength. We leave now. There is a cart waiting in the alley behind the chandler's shop 2 streets over. You will get in it, you will say nothing, you will ask no questions. The driver has his instructions. Your first lesson, Mr. Finch. From this moment on, you see everything, and you acknowledge nothing. He stood up as smoothly as he had arrived, leaving a single coin on the table for the ale he hadn't ordered. Welcome to the game. And with that, he turned and melted back into the crowd, leaving Alistair sitting alone, the weight of the letter now joined by the crushing weight of a future he could never have imagined, his old life gone, replaced by a terrifying pact with a ghost, and the first, perilous step of an impossible journey was about to begin. The cart's jolting, bone-rattling progress through the labyrinthine, sleeping back streets of London became the only reality Alistair Finch could comprehend, a terrifying, rhythmic lurching that mirrored the chaotic pounding of his own heart, each turn of the heavy wooden wheels taking him further from the life of quiet order he had known and deeper into a nightmare of shadows and whispered conspiracies, his body curled into a tight, fetal ball beneath the rough, foul-smelling cloak that now defined his existence, the coarse fabric scratching against his skin like a perpetual reminder of his fallen station, his senses overwhelmed by the pungent aroma of old grain from the sacks he was buried under, the sharp, ammonia-like scent of the horse ahead, and the damp, chill night air that seeped through the cloak to settle in his bones, a cold that had little to do with the weather and everything to do with the icy grip of sheer, undiluted terror that held him in its thrall, his mind racing in frantic, useless circles, trying and failing to piece together the enigmatic figure of Mr. Sterling, the man who sat just a few feet away, a silent, dark silhouette next to the gruff driver, a man who moved through the dangerous undercurrents of the city with the effortless grace of a deep-sea predator, who spoke of kings and congresses and global balances of power as if they were mere pieces on a chessboard that only he could see, who had dismantled Alastair's entire world and reassembled it into this terrifying new shape in the space of a single conversation in a smoky tavern. And the most chilling thought of all was the dawning realization that Sterling's intervention, his seemingly miraculous appearance, was not a matter of chance but of design, a fact that suggested Alastair had been watched long before he ever touched the Earl's letter, that his moment of moral crisis, his leap into treason, had been anticipated, perhaps even subtly engineered by forces he could not begin to comprehend, making him not a brave rebel but a pawn moved into position by a master he had never known was playing him. And this realization brought with it a new layer of despair, a profound sense of his own insignificance in a vast, dark game, and he clutched the leather pouch containing the letter even tighter to his chest, feeling the crisp outline of the parchment within. This single sheet of paper that had become the axis upon which his world now spun, an object of such immense potential power that it had transformed a nobody clerk into a fugitive worth hunting, a prize worth protecting, a symbol of hope for a peace that his own government sought to extinguish with cynical lies and planned brutality. And he wondered, with the ache that was almost physical, what was happening back at the Colonial Office. Had his absence been noted yet? Had the meticulously crafted replica he left behind been discovered as a fake? Was there already a quiet, urgent meeting taking place in an opulent, candlelit room where grim-faced men in fine waistcoats were authorizing a silent, ruthless manhunt, mobilizing the unseen machinery of the state to find him and retrieve their damning piece of propaganda before it could be used against them? And the image of those men, their cold efficiency, their absolute power, sent a fresh shiver of fear through him, and he strained his ears, listening over the clatter of the wheels and the horses' labored breathing for any sound that might signal discovery, the shout of a watchman, the sudden hail of a patrol, the thunder of hoofbeats closing in from behind. But there was nothing but the ordinary, sleeping sounds of the city, the occasional cry of a night bird, the distant bark of a dog, sounds that now seemed amplified and sinister in his heightened state of paranoia, and the cart continued its seemingly aimless journey, turning down narrower and ever more deserted lanes, at times passing through tunnels of overhanging buildings that blotted out the sliver of moon entirely, plunging him into periods of absolute blackness where he could see nothing and could only feel the cart's movement, and pray that Sterling's knowledge of this secret London was as complete as it seemed. And after an interminable period of this blind, jolting travel, the cart began to slow, and he heard the low, muttered exchange between Sterling and the driver. Words he couldn't make out, but the tone was tense, alert, and then the cart came to a complete stop, and the silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than the noise of travel had been, a thick, palpable silence broken only by the horse's snort and the creak of the driver shifting on his seat, and Alastair held his breath, his entire body rigid with fear, waiting for something, anything, to happen, and then he heard it, the sound that confirmed his deepest fears, the measured, unmistakable tread of two sets of booted feet approaching the cart from ahead. Walking in unison, a sound that spoke of military discipline, and a voice, crisp and authoritative, cut through the night air. "Halt there! By order of the king! State your business on the road at this hour." Time seemed to stretch and distort, each second in eternity, and Alastair braced himself for the end, for the rough hands that would drag him from his hiding place, for the cold iron of manacles, for the grim satisfaction on the faces of the men who had caught him. But instead of panic, he heard Sterling's voice, calm, even slightly bored, and laced with a touch of arrogant irritation that was so convincing it made Alastair doubt his own ears. "Our business? Our business is none of yours, Sergeant, though if you must know, we are on the private errand of Lord Chelmsford, and if you value your post, you will not delay us further with your pointless inquiries." There was a pause, a hesitation from the patrol leader, the name Lord Chelmsford evidently carrying significant weight, a name Sterling had produced like a hidden weapon, but the sergeant was diligent. "I'll need to see a pass for that, sir." "And what's in the cart?" Sterling's sigh was a masterpiece of weary impatience. "The cart contains precisely what it smells of, spoiled grain and empty sacks, destined for the compost heaps of his lordship's country estate. As for a pass," and here Sterling's voice dropped into a lower, more confidential, and somehow more threatening register. "Do you truly wish to involve Lord Chelmsford in this? To have me report to him that his urgent, and might I add, discreet, business was impeded by a sergeant of the watch on the outskirts of Southwark? He is a man with a formidable memory for names and a notorious impatience for impediments. I can give you the pass, but I strongly suggest you consider the cost of seeing it." The silence that followed was electric. Alistair, crammed under the sacks, could almost feel the sergeant's internal struggle, the conflict between duty and self-preservation, and after what felt like an age, the man's voice came again, noticeably less confident. "Very well, sir. Be on your way. Mind the roads ahead. There's been talk of trouble tonight." Sterling's reply was smooth as silk. "Your concern is noted. Good evening, Sergeant." The boots retreated, and a moment later, the cart lurched forward again, moving at a quicker pace now, and Alistair released the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline, not only from the narrowness of the escape but from the breathtaking audacity of Sterling's performance, the flawless, chilling bluff executed with the skill of a master thespian. A display that showed Alistair just how deep the waters were that he was now drowning in. And he understood that he was not just carrying a letter. He was entrusting his life to a man of limitless guile and unpredictable allegiance, a man for whom truth was merely another tool to be used. And as the cart rolled on, leaving the checkpoint behind, the first faint, gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, outlining the looming shapes of warehouses and the tall masts of ships. And he realized with a start that they were near the river, and the air began to carry the distinct, briny smell of the Thames, mixed with the tar and timber of the docks, and the cart made one final turn before stopping again, this time in the deep shadow of a massive, looming grain silo, and he heard Sterling jump down, his boots crunching on the gravel, and then the sacks were being pulled aside, and Sterling's face, pale and grim in the pre-dawn light, appeared above him, his gray eyes scanning the area swiftly before he spoke. His voice low and urgent. "The play at the checkpoint means they are already looking. The net is tightening. Our timetable has moved up. Get out. Quickly." And he offered a hand, not in kindness, but in necessity, pulling Alistair from the cart bed onto unsteady legs, the world swimming before his eyes after hours of darkness and confinement, and Sterling guided him towards a narrow, mist-shrouded alley that led between two vast warehouses straight to the water's edge, where the outlines of countless ships, large and small, were just becoming visible. A forest of masts and rigging against the lightening sky, and the smell of the river was overwhelming here, a mix of fish, mud, sewage, and salt, and the sounds were of creaking wood, flapping sails, and the cries of early rising gulls, and waiting for them at the end of a short, slimy stone jetty was a small, low-slung wherry, a boat used for ferrying passengers and goods across and along the river, and standing next to it was a hulking, broad-shouldered man with a weathered, seamed face and a single silver hoop earring. A man who looked like he had been carved from the same timber as the docks themselves, and he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to Sterling, his eyes, small and dark like chips of flint, flicking over Alistair with a look of pure, undisguised contempt, and waiting for them at the end of a short, slimy stone jetty was a small, low-slung wherry, a boat used for ferrying passengers and goods across and along the river. And standing next to it was a hulking, broad-shouldered man with a weathered, seamed face and a single silver hoop earring, a man who looked like he had been carved from the same timber as the docks themselves, and he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to Sterling, his eyes, small and dark like chips of flint, flicking over Alistair with a look of pure, undisguised contempt, and Sterling didn't bother with introductions, simply pressing a small, heavy coin purse into the ferryman's calloused hand, saying only, "The Sandpiper. You have until the tide turns. No mistakes." The ferryman hefted the purse, nodded once, and grunted, "Get in. And try not to vomit. I'll not have you fouling my boat." Sterling pushed Alistair forward towards the gently rocking boat, and as he stumbled onto the damp wooden plank seat, the reality of the next step of this impossible journey finally crashed down upon him. They were going onto the water, into the vast, chaotic expanse of the Thames, the main artery of the British Empire, a place teeming with naval patrols, customs cutters, and informants. And he was putting his life in the hands of this grim, silent ferryman who looked like he'd as soon slit a throat as ferry a passenger, and Sterling stepped into the boat behind him, settling with an unnerving stillness as the ferryman untied the rope and pushed them off from the jetty with a single, powerful thrust of his boot, the boat sliding silently into the deep, dark, swirling currents of the river, the lights of London beginning to wink out behind them as the dawn finally broke, revealing the immense, terrifying, and open path to the sea, the transition from the relative, albeit precarious, shelter of the land to the vast, open expanse of the Thames was a descent into a new and more profound level of vulnerability for Alastair Finch, the small wherry boat feeling impossibly flimsy and exposed as it was swallowed by the immense, grey, pre-dawn breadth of the river, the water itself a churning, dark slate-grey entity, cold and impersonal, its surface slick with a oily sheen and dotted with floating debris. The currents pulling and pushing at the little boat with a force that felt malicious and intentional, each dip and sway of the craft sending a fresh jolt of nauseating terror through him, his knuckles white as he gripped the damp, splintered wood of the seat, his senses completely overwhelmed by the new symphony of sounds, the rhythmic, slapping wash of water against the hull, the mournful cry of the gulls wheeling overhead like spectral observers, the distant, fog-muffled bells of buoys, and the occasional, deep-throated horn of a larger ship moving like a ghost. Through the mist further out, a sound that vibrated through the very planks beneath his feet, and the smells were a brutal assault of brine and decay, of rotting fish and human waste dumped from the city, of wet rope and tar, a pungent melange that combined with the boat's motion to churn his empty stomach violently, and through the thick, creeping tendrils of the river mist, the outlines of London on the banks began to soften and recede, transforming from a city of familiar, albeit threatening, streets into a jagged, dark silhouette, a monstrous creation of stone and smoke slowly being consumed by the distance and the fog, and he felt a terrifying, existential loneliness, a severing from the world he knew, and he was entirely at the mercy of the two silent, formidable figures sharing the boat with him, Mr. Sterling, who sat perfectly erect and immobile in the stern, his gaze not on Alastair, but constantly, relentlessly scanning the river in every direction, his eyes missing nothing, categorizing every other vessel, every movement on the banks, his entire being an instrument of perception and assessment, a hawk watching for any sign of the hunt that he knew was already underway, and the ferryman, a grim, silent giant of a man named Jedediah, whose massive, scarred hands worked the single, large oar with a practiced, effortless grace that spoke of a lifetime on this water. His face a mask of ingrained suspicion and simmering violence, his occasional spit into the river a gesture of pure contempt for everything around him, including, Alastair was certain, his two passengers, and the journey proceeded in this tense, wordless silence for what felt like an eternity, the only communication being the occasional, almost imperceptible gesture from Sterling, a slight tilt of the head, a raised finger, that would make Jedediah alter their course by a few degrees, angling them towards a particular shadow or away from an approaching set of running lights, a silent dance of evasion performed in the heart of one of the busiest waterways in the world, and Alastair, hunched under his scratchy cloak, the precious leather pouch a hard, demanding presence against his skin, could only watch and wait, his mind conjuring up every possible disaster, a Royal Navy patrol boat suddenly materializing from the fog to demand their papers, a customs inspector flagging them down for a random search, a hidden sharpshooter on a passing merchantman taking aim at Sterling's heart, each scenario ending in his own capture, torture, and very public execution, and the weight of the letter felt heavier than ever, not just as a physical object, but as a moral burden of catastrophic proportions, for he was now the sole, fragile link in a chain that stretched from the corrupt heart of Westminster to the hopeful, desperate halls of Philadelphia, and if that chain broke with him, the truth would be lost forever, buried at the bottom of the Thames or in an unmarked grave, and the war would come, a long, bloody conflict born of a lie, and the knowledge that he alone, insignificant Alastair Finch, was the only thing standing between that lie and its horrific fulfillment was a pressure so immense it threatened to crack his sanity, And just as he felt he could bear the tension no longer, Sterling held up a closed fist, a signal that brought Jedediah's rowing to an immediate, silent halt. The boat drifting on the current, and through the fog, Alistair could just make out the looming, dark shape of a large merchant ship anchored in a quieter stretch of the river, its sails furled, its name, Sandpiper, just visible on its hull in faded paint, and for a wild moment, Alistair felt a surge of hope, thinking this was their destination, their passage to freedom, but Sterling's posture remained tense, his head cocked, listening, and then Alistair heard it too, the distinct, rhythmic sound of oars moving with military precision, cutting through the water somewhere off to their port side, growing steadily louder, closer, and then a shape began to coalesce from the mist, a long, low, sleek cutter, its bank of oars moving in perfect unison, a Union Jack hanging limp but unmistakable from its stern, and standing in its bow, 2 uniformed officers, their hands resting on the pistols at their belts, their eyes fixed directly on their fragile little wherry, and Jedediah muttered a low, vicious curse, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of a long, wicked-looking knife tucked into his belt, but Sterling's voice, a razor-sharp whisper, cut through the panic. "Hold! Not a move! Not a word!" The cutter glided to a stop a mere 20 yards away, the water sloshing against its hull sounding terrifyingly loud in the sudden silence, and one of the officers, a young man with a lean, arrogant face, cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, his voice cutting across the water with official authority. "Ahoy the wherry! Heave to and identify yourselves! By order of the Royal Customs Service!" Time seemed to freeze. Alistair's heart felt like it would burst from his chest. This was it. The game was over. They had no papers, no legitimate story that would withstand even the most cursory inspection. The letter in his pouch was a death warrant. He looked at Sterling, waiting for the signal to fight, to flee, to do something, but Sterling merely rose slowly to his full height in the swaying boat, his movement calm and deliberate, and instead of fear or defiance, his face was arranged into an expression of mildly inconvenienced authority, and when he spoke, his voice was not the low whisper of the spy but a clear, ringing, aristocratic tenor that carried effortlessly over the water, dripping with bored entitlement. "You there, officer! What is the meaning of this absurd interruption? Do you have any idea who you are delaying?" The customs man, taken aback by this display of confident arrogance, faltered for a second. I am performing my duty, sir. All river traffic is subject to inspection. Please state your name and business." Sterling gave a short, derisive laugh. "My business is the business of the Crown, you impudent fool. I am on a direct assignment from Lord North's office. This person," he said, gesturing dismissively at Jedediah, "is ferrying me to a confidential meeting with a naval intelligence contact aboard the HMS Vigilant. My credentials are for their eyes only, not for some river patrol to gawk at. Now be a good man and carry on with your fishing elsewhere. You are compromising a highly sensitive operation." The bluff was even more breathtakingly audacious than the one at the checkpoint. He was invoking the Prime Minister's name, and the Royal Navy itself. The young officer looked uncertain, glancing back at his superior, an older, more grizzled man with a skeptical squint, who called out, "A convenient story, sir. Everyone on this river has a confidential meeting when we board them. We'll need to see some proof." Sterling's sigh was a masterpiece of long-suffering exasperation. "Proof? Very well. But when I report this interference to Admiral Graves, and I assure you I will, your careers will be the proof of your stupidity." He slowly, deliberately, reached inside his coat, and for a heart-stopping moment, Alistair was certain he was going for a weapon, that the next seconds would be filled with gunfire and bloodshed in the fog, but instead, his hand emerged holding not a pistol, but a small, leather-bound folder, which he opened, extracting a single card. He held it up. Even from this distance, Alistair could see it was embossed with some official seal, glinting in the weak light. "Does this satisfy your curiosity?" Sterling's voice was ice. "Or shall I have you row me to the Vigilant so her captain can explain the chain of command to you personally?" The older officer squinted, trying to make out the card in the dim, foggy light. The authority in Sterling's voice, the sheer confidence, the specific names, Lord North, Admiral Graves, HMS Vigilant. It was a devastating psychological assault. The older man finally nodded, his face grim. He clearly didn't believe the story, but he also wasn't willing to risk his career on calling the bluff of someone who could so casually invoke such powerful names. "My apologies, sir," he called out, his voice strained. "Carry on. The Vigilant is anchored further down, near the pool." Sterling gave a curt, dismissive nod, not a trace of relief on his face, only continued annoyance. "See that you do not trouble me again." He sat back down as if nothing had happened, and the cutter, after a moment's hesitation, began to pull away, its oars dipping back into the water, slowly disappearing back into the mist from which it came. The silence it left behind was deafening. Jedediah let out a slow, shaky breath he'd been holding. Alistair felt dizzy, his body trembling with the aftershock. He looked at Sterling, who was already scanning the river again, his face once more an unreadable mask. The man wasn't just a spy, he was a magician, a master of illusion and psychological warfare. He had turned certain capture into a mere inconvenience with nothing but words and a piece of card. As Jedediah began to row again, steering them not towards the naval vessel but towards the waiting merchant ship Sandpiper, Alistair understood that the real danger was not just the government hunting them, but the terrifying, mesmerizing man who was now his only protector, a man who could conjure identities and authority from the mist, and whose true goals remained a terrifying mystery. The Sandpiper loomed larger, its dark hull a promise of the next, even more perilous leg of the journey into the unknown. The Sandpiper, which had seemed a distant promise of sanctuary from the river's perils, now loomed as a monstrous, creaking leviathan of weathered timber and tarred rigging, its dark hull rising sheer and imposing from the murky, churning water of the Thames, the sight of it sending a fresh, more profound wave of dread through Alistair Finch, for this was not a sleek naval vessel or a genteel passenger's ship, but a workhorse of the sea. A merchantman that had clearly endured countless hard voyages, its sides streaked with salt and rust, its sails patched and grayed by sun and storm, a vessel that spoke not of escape but of hardship and relentless, grinding labor, and as Jedediah expertly guided the fragile wherry alongside it, the contrast between the two crafts was terrifying, one a tiny, vulnerable shell on the water, the other a towering, indifferent fortress, and from the deck high above, a face appeared over the gunwale, grizzled and unshaven, peering down at them with a look of profound annoyance before a rope ladder, frayed and stained, was unceremoniously tossed over the side, uncoiling itself to slap against the hull just feet from their boat, a flimsy, swinging invitation to ascend into the unknown, and Sterling was moving immediately, with that unnerving economy of motion, grabbing the bottom of the ladder and turning to Alistair, his grey eyes hard and urgent in the flat morning light. "You first. Do not look down. Do not hesitate. If you fall, you will not be fished out. Move." The command brooked no argument, and with limbs that felt like lead and trembled violently, Alistair grasped the rough, wet hemp of the ladder, the coarse fibers scraping against his soft clerk's hands, and he began to climb, each rung a terrifying ordeal, the ladder twisting and swaying with his weight and the movement of the river beneath him, the world reducing to the feel of the rope in his hands. The sight of the barnacle-encrusted hull inches from his face, and the dizzying void below, where the dark water swirled hungrily, and he could hear the groans and creaks of the ship itself, a symphony of strain and age, and the shouts of the crew above, muffled and coarse, and the higher he climbed, the more the wind tugged at his clumsy cloak, threatening to pluck him from his precarious perch and dash him into the cold embrace of the Thames, and his arms burned with an agony he had never known, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps, but he kept climbing, driven by a primal fear of the man below him and the certain death that waited if he failed, until finally, rough, calloused hands grabbed him under his arms and hauled him, stumbling and gasping, over the gunwale and onto the solid, if wildly pitching, deck of the Sandpiper, where he collapsed onto the wet planking, his lungs heaving, his entire body shaking with exhaustion and residual terror. And he was immediately surrounded by a semicircle of hard, unfriendly faces, men with skin leathered by wind and sun, dressed in stained and practical clothing, their eyes holding not curiosity but a flat, calculating coldness, assessing him as they would a piece of dubious cargo, and a moment later, Sterling landed lightly on the deck beside him, not even out of breath, his gaze sweeping over the crew with a dismissive air that seemed to instantly establish a fragile, tense hierarchy, and the man who had pulled Alistair aboard, who he presumed was the captain, a bear of a man with a wild, graying beard and small, shrewd eyes buried in a web of wrinkles, stepped forward, his arms crossed over his barreled chest. "Sterling," he grunted, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "You're late. And you bring this landsman onto my ship? He looks like a strong wind would knock him over. Explain yourself." Sterling didn't flinch, meeting the captain's glare with his own icy calm. "Captain Briggs, this landsman is my business. His passage and his silence are paid for generously. You need know nothing more. Is the cabin prepared? And the other matter?" Captain Briggs's eyes narrowed, but the mention of payment seemed to temper his anger, though his suspicion remained palpable. "Aye, the cabin's ready, such as it is. And your other matter is stowed below. Risky business, that. I don't like it. The river's crawling with patrols this morning. More than usual. They're looking for something. Or someone." His eyes flicked meaningfully towards Alistair, who was still trying to get his bearings on the unsteady deck. Sterling's expression didn't change. "Their search is of no concern to you. You are a merchant ship carrying a load of Welsh wool and a few passengers to Boston. Your papers are in order. Just ensure your crew remembers that story. Any deviation, and our arrangement becomes void." The threat, though delivered softly, was clear, and Captain Briggs's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. "Aye. My men know to keep their mouths shut. But if we're boarded—" "We will not be boarded," Sterling stated, with a finality that seemed to suck the air from the space between them. "See to your ship, Captain. We need to catch the tide." With a final, distrustful glare at Alistair, Captain Briggs turned and began bellowing orders to his crew, a stream of profanity-laced commands that sent men scrambling up the rigging and hauling on ropes, the deck erupting into a controlled chaos of activity as the ship began to prepare for departure, and Sterling grabbed Alistair's arm, pulling him to his feet and steering him across the heaving deck towards a low doorway that led below, into the bowels of the vessel, and the world below. Decks was a different kind of nightmare, a cramped, dark, airless realm smelling overpoweringly of damp wool, rotten wood, bilge water, and the pungent sweat of too many men living in too close quarters, the ceiling so low Sterling had to stoop, and Alistair was practically bent double, the sounds from the deck above muffled but replaced by the agonized groaning of the ship's timbers and the slosh of water somewhere frighteningly close. And Sterling led him to a tiny, closet-like cabin barely large enough for two narrow bunks stacked one on top of the other, a small, gimbaled lantern providing a feeble, swaying light that cast monstrous, dancing shadows on the damp walls. "This is yours," Sterling said, his voice devoid of any sympathy for the squalor. "You will stay here. You will not come out unless I come for you. You will speak to no one. Is that clear?" Alistair could only nod, his throat too tight to speak, the reality of his confinement crashing down on him. This damp, tiny, reeking box was to be his world for the unimaginable duration of a transatlantic crossing, a journey of weeks. The captain is a greedy man, which makes him predictable and therefore useful, but he is not a friend. His crew are cutthroats and debtors. They would sell you for a shilling. Trust no one. Eat only the food I bring you. The letter stays on your person at all times. Sleep with it in your hand." He turned to leave, but Alistair found his voice, a hoarse, desperate croak. "Wait, where are you going? What is the other matter?" Sterling paused in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the faint light from the passageway. "My whereabouts are not your concern. The other matter is insurance. A passenger, whose presence on this ship, should we be discovered, will provide a much more interesting story for the authorities than a missing clerk. It is a distraction, should we need one. Now, remember the rules. Your life depends on your silence and your stillness." And with that, he was gone, closing the thin wooden door behind him, and Alistair heard the unmistakable sound of a bolt being shot home on the outside, locking him in. He was a prisoner, albeit a privileged one, in this floating wooden coffin. He sank onto the lower bunk, the straw stuffing crackling and smelling of mildew, and put his head in his hands, the full, horrifying scope of his situation finally, utterly inescapable. He was trapped on a ship of strangers, hunted by his own government, reliant on a man whose motives were a complete mystery, bound for a war-torn continent he knew nothing about, carrying a secret that could alter history, and the only thing between him and 1,000 different terrible ends was his own silence and a locked door. The sounds of the ship changed around him, the shouts of the crew taking on a new urgency, the vibrations through the hull deepening, and he felt a great lurch, followed by a new, powerful motion, the slow, ponderous roll of a ship catching the wind and the tide, leaving the relative safety of the river for the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the open sea. The journey had truly begun, and with it, a new, deeper layer of fear and isolation, as London vanished behind the curtain of mist and sea spray, and the sandpiper carved its way into the immense, grey, empty horizon. The immense, rhythmic, and terrifying motion of the open sea was a form of torture Alastair Finch could never have conceived in his worst nightmares, a relentless, sickening swaying and plunging that began the moment the sandpiper cleared the mouth of the Thames and met the full, unimpeded force of the North Atlantic, each monumental wave that struck the hull sounding like a cannon shot, shuddering through the very bones of the ship and the soul of the man trapped within its dank belly, the world reduced to a nauseating cycle of climbing a liquid mountain of grey, churning water only to hang, suspended for a heart-stopping moment at the crest before plunging down, down into a trough that seemed to descend into the very abyss itself, the roar of the wind and water. A constant, deafening scream that drowned out all other thought, and for Alastair, chained by fear and Sterling's orders to his tiny, reeking cabin, the confinement became a crucible of physical and mental agony, his landsman's stomach revolting violently against emotion until he had nothing left to vomit but bitter, painful bile, his body drenched in a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the chill, damp air. His head pounding with a dehydration headache that throbbed in time with the crashing waves, and the darkness of his prison was absolute for long stretches, the gimbaled lantern having sputtered out, leaving him in a blackness so complete he could not see his own hand before his face. A sensory deprivation that amplified every groan and crack of the ship's timbers, every sound from the deck above sounding like the prelude to disaster. Every shout from the crew a potential signal of an approaching naval patrol or a mutiny underway, and the hours bled into days, a meaningless procession of torment measured only by the occasional appearance of Mr. Sterling, who would unbolt the door and bring him a tin mug of watery, brackish beer and a hard, weevil-infested ship's biscuit, his manner always detached, clinical, assessing Alastair's deteriorating condition with the same dispassionate eye he might use to evaluate a piece of equipment, offering no words of comfort, only terse reminders. Eat. You need your strength. The letter. Where is it? And Alastair would fumble for the leather pouch, his trembling hands proving it was still secure against his skin, and Sterling would nod, his face a pale, impassive mask in the faint light of the lantern he sometimes carried, before locking the door again, leaving Alastair to his misery and his terrifying, growing paranoia, for during the long, black, interminable hours, his mind, starved of sensory input and addled by fear and nausea, began to turn against itself, conjuring increasingly elaborate and horrifying scenarios. What if Sterling was not a third-party agent but a loyalist provocateur, luring him onto this ship not to save him but to dispose of him far from prying eyes, to drown him and the inconvenient truth he carried in the endless, depthless ocean? What if the mysterious other matter, the insurance policy stowed somewhere below, was in fact a squad of soldiers waiting to arrest him the moment they were beyond sight of land? What if the entire crew knew what he carried and were merely waiting for Sterling's signal to murder him in his sleep and claim the valuable document for themselves? These thoughts festered in the darkness, fed by the hostile, suspicious glances he had caught from the crew during his brief, vertigo-inducing glimpse of the deck during the boarding, and the sheer, utter helplessness of his situation was a weight heavier than any wave, a profound understanding that he was utterly, completely at the mercy of forces and people he did not understand. A piece of cargo being shipped to a destination for a purpose that remained shrouded in mystery, and his only tether to reality, to the moral imperative that had started this nightmare, was the feel of the parchment in the pouch, a solid, crackling reminder of the thousands of lives, the entire future of a continent, that depended on his survival and his silence, and he would clutch it until his fingers cramped, repeating the noble words of the Earl's letter in his mind like a prayer. A mantra to ward off the insanity that lapped at the edges of his consciousness. And then, on what he thought might be the third or fourth day, a new sound pierced the constant roar of the storm, a different kind of shout from above, sharper, more urgent, followed by the thunder of many boots running across the deck, and then the terrifying, unmistakable sound of a cannon shot, not the crash of a wave, but a sharp, concussive boom that reverberated through the ship's frame, and his blood turned to ice, for this could only mean one thing: they were under attack. Either by a French privateer or, far worse, a British naval vessel that had caught up to them, and a moment later, the bolt on his door screeched back and Sterling stood there. But he was different. The usual impeccable calm was gone, replaced by a sharp, lethal intensity, his eyes blazing in the dim light, a pistol in one hand and a drawn, wicked-looking cutlass in the other, and his clothes were spattered with salt spray and something darker, something that looked like blood. "Get up!" he snapped, his voice cutting through Alistair's terror. "We are being boarded. It is the Navy. They have shot across our bow. They know we are here." He tossed a heavy, greasy seaman's jacket at Alistair. "Put this on. Pull the hood up. Keep your head down, and do exactly as I say. If we are separated, your only task is to destroy the letter. Tear it to pieces and throw it overboard. Do not let them take it. Do you understand? Its destruction is more important than your life now." The words were like a death sentence, final and absolute. Alistair's limbs, weak and trembling, somehow obeyed, pulling on the foul-smelling jacket as Sterling grabbed his arm and hauled him out of the cabin and into the chaotic, terrifying world of the main deck, which was a scene from hell itself. The sky was a bruised, angry gray, the wind howling, whipping rain and stinging salt spray horizontally across the deck, which was canted at a frightening angle, and through the mist and driving rain. He could see the terrifyingly sleek, powerful shape of a British naval sloop of war, its gun ports open and cannons run out, keeping pace with the lumbering sandpiper with predatory ease, and a boarding party was already swarming across the gap between the two ships on grappling lines, red-coated marines with bayonets fixed and naval sailors with cutlasses and pistols, their shouts and curses ripped away by the wind, and the crew of the Sandpiper, under the bellowed commands of Captain Briggs, was putting up a desperate, vicious fight, not out of loyalty to Sterling or Alistair, but out of the universal law of the sea that resisted any attempt to take a man's ship. The air filled with the clash of steel, the crack of pistols, and the screams of the wounded, the deck already slick with blood and seawater, and Sterling, still gripping Alistair's arm, moved through this chaos like a demon, his cutlass a blur of silver, deflecting a bayonet thrust here, disarming a sailor there. Not seeking to kill but to create a path. His movements so fluid and precise they were almost beautiful in their deadly efficiency, shoving Alistair towards the starboard rail, away from the main press of the fighting. "The longboat!" Sterling yelled over the din, pointing to a smaller boat lashed to the deck. "We have to cut it free!" But as they neared it, a group of 3 Marines broke away from the melee, their faces set in grim determination, their muskets leveled, and their officer, a young lieutenant with a look of fanatical zeal, shouted, "Halt! In the name of the King! Surrender the traitor Finch and the document!" Sterling didn't break stride. He shoved Alistair hard behind a capstan, putting the heavy wooden drum between him and the muskets, and in the same motion, his pistol barked, and the lead Marine crumpled to the deck, a spray of crimson arcing across the planking, and then Sterling was among them, his cutlass a whirlwind of steel, parrying a bayonet, and driving his blade into the second Marine's shoulder. But the lieutenant was fast, sidestepping and lunging. Not at Sterling, but at Alistair cowering behind the capstan, his bayonet aimed straight at his heart, and Alistair froze, staring death in the face. But before the thrust could land, a massive shape barreled into the lieutenant from the side. It was Jedediah, the ferryman, his face a mask of brutal fury, a boarding axe in his hand, which he buried in the lieutenant's chest with a sickening crunch. The young officer's eyes wide with shock before he fell, and Jedediah turned to Sterling, his chest heaving. "The longboat's hold! They shot it full of splinters getting alongside! It's useless!" Sterling's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of something, not fear, but a furious, cold calculation as he processed this catastrophic setback, his plan unraveling in the blood and chaos, and his eyes scanned the raging battle, the Sandpiper's crew being slowly, inexorably overwhelmed by the disciplined naval boarding party, and then his gaze fell on the naval sloop itself, rocking violently on the waves beside them. Its deck now mostly emptied of its crew, who were all engaged on the Sandpiper, and a wild, insane plan seemed to form in his eyes, and he grabbed Alistair again, his grip like iron. "Change of plan! We're taking their ship!" he shouted, and before Alistair could even process the insanity of the idea, Sterling was pulling him towards the rail, towards the grappling lines that connected the two vessels, a precarious, swinging bridge of ropes over a churning, foaming gap of certain death. "Climb! Now!" Sterling commanded, shoving him towards the ropes, and with the screams of the dying and the roar of the storm in his ears, Alistair Finch, a clerk who had never climbed anything more daring than a library ladder, grasped the wet, straining rope and launched himself out over the furious, hungry sea, towards the deck of a British warship. The space between the two ships was a yawning, frothing chasm of pure terror. A gap that seemed to physically embody the leap from his old life of quiet certainty into this new existence of screaming chaos and mortal peril, the wind tearing at his body with gale-force fury, trying to pluck him from the wildly swaying grappling line and dash him into the churning, grey oblivion below, where the waves crashed against the hulls with the sound of grinding stones, and Alistair Finch, his soft clerk's hands raw and bleeding from the coarse, wet hemp, moved across that impossible bridge not through courage, of which he had none left, but through a pure, animal instinct for survival that had been honed to a razor's edge by days of fear and moments of sheer terror, his entire world reduced to the next handhold, the next foot placement, the burning agony in his muscles, the rope cutting into his flesh, the deafening roar of the storm and the battle raging behind him on the deck of the Sandpiper, the clash of steel, the sporadic crack of musketry, the guttural shouts and death screams, all merging into a single, hellish symphony that propelled him forward, and below him, the sea yawned, a cold, hungry mouth eager to swallow him whole, and he dared not look down, dared not think, could only cling and move, each inch gained a minor victory against the abyss, and ahead of him, Mr. Sterling moved with the preternatural grace of a tightrope walker, his passage across the line seemingly effortless, a dark spectre against the bruised sky. Already reaching the far rail of the naval sloop and vaulting over it with his cutlass held ready, disappearing from view for a heart-stopping moment before his hand reappeared, gesturing frantically for Alistair to hurry, and Alistair, with a final, desperate lunge that sent a searing pain through his shoulder, managed to hook his leg over the gunwale of the warship and tumble over, landing in a heap on the hard, steeply angled deck, gasping for air that was ripped from his lungs by the wind, his body trembling uncontrollably, and he looked up to see Sterling already engaged in a vicious, silent fight with the few crew members left aboard the sloop, a young midshipman who looked no older than 16, armed with a dirk, and two older sailors wielding belaying pins, and Sterling dispatched them with a brutal, clinical efficiency that was horrifying to witness, not a motion wasted, a sharp blow to the head here, a disarming twist and a pommel strike to the temple there, leaving the three men unconscious or groaning on the deck within seconds, and then Sterling was at the helm, his hands on the great wheel, his eyes scanning the complex web of rigging and sails with an expert's knowledge, shouting commands to Alistair that were torn away by the wind. "The braces! The bloody braces! Haul on that line! The blue one! Now, man, now!" And Alistair, bewildered and terrified, stumbled to where Sterling was pointing, to a thick, taut rope coiled near a winch, and he pulled on it with all his failing strength, feeling it burn through his palms. But nothing happened, the rope was immovable, and Sterling cursed, letting go of the wheel for a perilous second to slash his cutlass through a series of lines with precise, devastating cuts. The canvas above instantly luffing and snapping like gunshots before he grabbed the wheel again and spun it hard to starboard, and the sleek warship, responsive in a way the lumbering Sandpiper could never be, answered immediately, heeling over sharply and carving a new path away from the merchantman, the gap between the two ships widening rapidly, and from the deck of the Sandpiper, now a scene of continuing but diminishing conflict. There were shouts of alarm and confusion as the British boarding party realized their own ship was being stolen out from under them, and a few muskets were leveled, and shots rang out, one ball splintering the rail inches from Alistair's head, another tearing through the mainsail, and Sterling, still wrestling with the wheel to control the bucking vessel in the monstrous seas, yelled at Alistair. "Get down! And find the captain's cabin! Look for charts! A logbook! Anything that tells us where we are!" And Alistair, scrambling on hands and knees across the pitching, spray-soaked deck, found a companionway and half fell down the stairs into the relative quiet of the below decks, which were a stark contrast to the filthy, cramped confines of the Sandpiper. Here, everything was neat, orderly, and military, the halls narrow but clean, the smell of tar and polish replacing the stench of rot and bilge. And he stumbled through a door into what was clearly the captain's quarters, a small, functional space with the desk bolted to the floor, a narrow cot, and a wall of bookshelves filled with rolled charts and leather-bound logs, and he began frantically pulling them down, his wet, numb fingers fumbling with the ties, unrolling charts of the English Channel, the North Sea, the Atlantic approaches, covered in precise, inked lines and notations, until he found one that was pinned to the desk, a larger, more detailed chart with a course plotted on it, and his eyes, trained for detail in the ledgers of the Colonial Office, quickly deciphered the notations. Their position was marked off the coast of Cornwall, and the plotted course was an interception path aimed directly at the Sandpiper's known route, and with a sinking heart, he realized the Navy hadn't found them by chance. They had been hunting them, they knew exactly where to look. Which meant the net around them was far tighter and more intelligent than Sterling had believed, and as this terrifying thought took root, his eyes fell on a piece of paper tucked under a navigation instrument, a hastily written dispatch that had not yet been filed, and the words on it made his blood run cold. Intercept and board the merchant vessel Sandpiper, Registry London. Believed to be carrying one Alistair Finch, a clerk wanted for high treason and theft of state documents, and one Mr. Sterling, a known agent of unknown allegiance, highly dangerous. Cargo may also include a person of high-value interest to His Majesty's government. All measures authorized to retrieve the documents. Capture preferred, but lethal force is authorized if necessary. The traitor Finch is not to reach American shores. The words lethal force is authorized seemed to burn into his retina, the official confirmation of his death sentence, and the mention of a person of high-value interest explained Sterling's insurance. But it also meant the stakes were infinitely higher than he had imagined, and he was still reeling from this discovery when the door to the cabin burst open and Sterling stood there. His clothes soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead, his expression grim. "What did you find?" he demanded, and Alistair, wordlessly, his hand shaking, held out the dispatch, and Sterling's eyes scanned it rapidly, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. "So they know my name," he said softly, a statement that held a world of dangerous implications. "And they know about our guest. This changes nothing. It only makes our margin for error zero." He grabbed the chart from the desk, his eyes tracing the course. "Good. They have provisions for a long chase. We'll need them." He looked at Alistair, and for the first time, Alistair saw something like genuine, unvarnished intensity in the man's gray eyes. "Listen to me carefully, Finch. The Royal Navy does not have just one ship. This sloop was the hunter. Now it is the prey. Every British vessel from here to Boston will be looking for this ship. We cannot outrun them all. We cannot fight them. Our only hope is to disappear." He rolled up the chart. "We are going to do something they will never expect. We are not running for the open Atlantic. We are turning back. We are going to sail right back up the channel, right under their noses, and make for the one place they will never think to look for a pair of traitors fleeing to America." He didn't wait for a response, turning and heading back to the deck, leaving Alistair alone in the cabin, the horrifying, insane audacity of the plan washing over him. To turn back towards London, towards the very heart of the power that wanted him dead, to sail into the lion's den voluntarily. It was madness. It was suicide. And as he felt the warship heel over once more, beginning its desperate, counterintuitive turn back towards the most dangerous waters on earth, he understood that Mr. Sterling was not just a spy or a master of disguise. He was a gambler who played for the highest stakes imaginable, and Alistair Finch, wanted for treason, was now trapped on a stolen warship, heading directly towards the source of all his terror. With a man who believed the best way to hide was to dance in front of the executioner's axe. The turn was not a gentle change of course but a violent, wrenching rebellion against the very sea itself, a maneuver of such breathtaking audacity that it felt less like a strategic decision and more like an act of sheer, defiant madness. The stolen naval sloop, whose name Alastair now saw painted on a broken piece of debris, was the HMS Sparrowhawk, fighting against the colossal, wind-driven waves that wanted to push it ever westward into the open ocean, its sleek hull shuddering and groaning in protest as Sterling, his hands locked on the great wheel, muscles straining with an almost superhuman effort, forced it to come about, the bow swinging agonizingly slowly through the roaring wind and driving rain, the world a dizzying, terrifying whirl of grey water and leaden sky, the sails snapping and cracking like a volley of musketry as they lost the wind and then, with a final, shuddering lurch, caught it again from a new, opposite direction, filling with a boom that shook the entire vessel and sent it heeling over at a precipitous angle, racing now back the way it had come, back towards the English coast and the certain, intensified hunt that awaited them, and Alastair, clinging to a secured gun carriage for dear life, his stomach lurching with the violent motion, could only watch in stunned, terrified disbelief as the Sandpiper, now a distant, diminishing speck and shrouded in mist and rain, its deck still a confused melee of red coats and desperate sailors, was left behind, a pawn sacrificed in Sterling's insane game, and the reality of their new situation crashed over him with the force of the waves crashing over the bow. They were now alone on a stolen king's ship, a vessel every other British captain from Land's End to Dover would be ordered to hunt down and sink on sight, heading not towards the vast, hiding emptiness of the Atlantic but into the busiest, most heavily patrolled shipping lane in the world, the English Channel, a watery highway teeming with naval traffic, revenue cutters, and merchantmen whose captains would gladly report the sighting of a lone sloop of war behaving erratically, and Sterling, his face a mask of concentrated fury, shouted commands that were ripped away by the gale, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the charts, the compass, performing the work of an entire crew by himself through sheer, terrifying willpower. And he barked at Alastair to make himself useful, to secure the loose lines, whipping around the deck like angry serpents, to pump the bilges that were already taking on water from the storm and the battle damage, tasks for which Alastair was pathetically ill-suited, his soft hands tearing anew on the rough ropes, his muscles screaming in protest, but he obeyed, driven by the primal understanding that his survival was now inextricably linked to the madman at the helm. And as the hours bled together in a blur of exhausting, wet, cold labor and soul-crushing fear, the storm began to abate, the wind dropping from a scream to a mournful howl, the waves settling from monstrous peaks into a heavy, rolling swell, and a weak, watery sunlight began to break through the scudding clouds, revealing the immense, empty expanse of the sea around them, an emptiness that was itself a threat, for it offered no cover, no place to hide the distinct, unmistakable profile of a Royal Navy vessel from any watching eyes. And it was in this relative calm that Sterling, his energy seemingly undiminished, produced a spyglass from a locker and began a methodical, endless scan of the horizon, his body tense, a predator sensing other predators in the vastness, and then he froze, the glass fixed on a point to the northeast, his face grim. There. A frigate. 38 guns. Heading on an intercept course, he said, his voice flat, and Alastair's heart plummeted, his eyes straining to see what Sterling saw, and soon he could make it out too. A larger, much more powerful ship, its 3 masts a forest of canvas, flying the Union Jack, moving with a purposeful speed that left no doubt of its intentions, and Sterling didn't panic, his mind working with a cold, computer-like efficiency. They've seen us. They'll be signaling. We must look like we belong. Run up the signals for chasing a suspect vessel and require no assistance. The flags are in that locker. The codes are in the book. Be quick. Alastair, his mind reeling, fumbled with the locker, finding the colorful, bundled signal flags in a thick, water-stained book of coded messages, his fingers trembling as he tried to decipher the complex system, the pressure immense, knowing that a wrong flag, a delayed response, would mean their immediate destruction, and with Sterling snapping instructions, he managed to haul up the correct sequence of flags. Watching in agonized suspense as the frigate, now close enough to see the individual gun ports, seemed to slow, its own flags running up in response, a query, a demand for identification, and Sterling, his spyglass never wavering, muttered, "They're not buying it. They're bringing out a long glass for a closer look. They'll see the damage to our rails, the blood on the deck." His voice trailed off, and then he did something then that defied all logic, all understanding of naval warfare. He turned the Sparrowhawk not away from the frigate, but directly towards it, a move so suicidal, so utterly insane, that Alastair cried out in protest, but Sterling's face was set in a look of fierce concentration. "They expect us to run. So we will not run. We will say hello." He shoved the spyglass into Alastair's hands. "Get to the portside battery. When I give the word, you will wave. Smile. Look like a cheerful, obedient midshipman acknowledging his betters. Your life depends on your performance." Alastair, his legs like jelly, scrambled to the side of the ship, forcing his face into what he hoped was a convincing expression of eager subservience as the massive frigate, a floating fortress of oak and cannon, loomed larger and larger. So close now he could see the faces of the sailors on her deck, the officers on the quarterdeck staring at them through their own glasses, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. And Sterling, now playing the part of the ship's captain, stood tall by the wheel, raising a hand in a casual, confident salute, and for a long, heart-stopping moment, the two ships sailed parallel, close enough to hail, the tension so thick Alastair could taste it, a metallic fear in the air, and he waved, a stupid, frantic gesture, his face aching from the false smile, and then, miraculously, a figure on the frigate's deck waved back, and the larger ship began to turn away. Its captain apparently satisfied by the bold, confident display, its sails catching the wind as it resumed its original course, and Alastair slumped against the rail, weak with relief, but Sterling was already snapping. "Don't relax. They'll report our position and heading. The ruse only bought us time, not freedom." He was right. No sooner had the frigate disappeared into the haze than a new threat appeared. A sleek, fast-moving revenue cutter, its purpose to hunt smugglers, was slicing through the water towards them, and this time, there was no pretense, no exchange of signals. A warning shot fired from its bow chaser splashed into the water 100 yards ahead of them, an unambiguous command to heave to, and Sterling's face went pale, not with fear, but with a cold, killing rage. "That is a problem. They are quicker and more nimble than we are. We cannot outrun them, and we cannot fight them." His eyes darted around the deck, landing on the small, covered longboat lashed amidships. "The boat. We abandoned ship." "Abandoned ship?" Alastair choked out, staring at the tiny boat in the vast, cold sea. "In this? It's suicide. Staying here is certain death. They will board us, and we will hang. Now help me." Sterling was already slashing at the lines holding the longboat, and together, with a strength born of pure desperation, they managed to manhandle the heavy boat to the rail and push it overboard, where it landed with a crash in the water, and Sterling shoved a cask of water and a sack that felt like hardtack into Alastair's arms. "Get in! Now!" And they scrambled down the side of the sloop on ropes, dropping into the wildly rocking longboat just as the cutter fired another, closer warning shot, and Sterling, working the oars with powerful, frantic strokes, pulled them away from the drifting Sparrowhawk, aiming for a low bank of sea fog that was rolling in from the east, a last, desperate hope for concealment, and as the fog enveloped them, swallowing the world in a damp, gray silence, the sounds of the cutter and their stolen warship faded away, and they were alone again, adrift in a tiny, leaking shell on the immense, indifferent ocean, the grand theft of a naval vessel ending not in glory, but in a desperate, precarious escape into a blinding whiteness, their only possession the clothes on their backs, a little food and water, and the world-changing secret still hidden against Alastair's skin, their destination more uncertain than ever. Their future reduced to the next pull on the oars and the mercy of the fog and the sea. The fog was a tangible, suffocating entity, a thick, damp, gray-white shroud that swallowed sound and sight and direction, reducing the world to the immediate, claustrophobic confines of the small, leaking longboat and the rhythmic, straining sound of Sterling's oars dipping into the water, each pull a monumental effort against the heavy, rolling swell that lifted them up and dropped them down in a sickening, disorienting rhythm. The silence around them absolute and unnerving, broken only by the drip of water from the oars, the creak of the wooden hull, and their own labored breathing, A silence that felt more threatening than the roar of battle or the scream of the storm, for within it, every imagined sound became a potential threat. The ghostly echo of a ship's bell, the far-off shout of a lookout, the splash of an oar that wasn't Sterling's, and Alistair, huddled in the bow of the boat. The coarse cloak pulled tight around him against the penetrating chill, felt his sanity beginning to fray at the edges. The events of the past hours, the brutal fight on the Sandpiper, the death of the Marine, the insane theft of the warship, the heart-stopping encounter with the frigate, the desperate flight into the fog, replaying in his mind on a nightmarish loop, each memory more terrifying than the last, and he clutched the leather pouch containing the letter so tightly his fingernails dug into his own palm. The physical pain a welcome anchor to reality, a reminder of the purpose that had somehow survived this maelstrom of violence and chaos, and he watched Sterling, who sat amidships, his back to him, rowing with a steady, relentless, machine-like precision that seemed to defy human exhaustion, his posture erect, his breathing controlled, his entire being focused on the single task of putting distance between them and the certain death they had left behind on the Sparrowhawk. A man who had just orchestrated one of the most audacious and impossible escapes Alistair could conceive of, and who showed no visible sign of strain or emotion, as if stealing a king's ship and abandoning it in the middle of the channel were all in a day's work. And this thought, this terrifying glimpse into the true nature of the man he was chained to, sent a fresh, deep chill through Alistair that had nothing to do with the cold, and after what felt like an eternity of blind, silent rowing, Sterling finally rested the oars, letting the boat drift on the current, the fog so thick now that Alistair could not see the water a foot beyond the gunwale, and Sterling turned, his face pale and beaded with moisture in the gloom, his grey eyes seeming to glow with their own internal light, and he spoke, his voice a low murmur that was absorbed by the fog. "We need to take stock. The boat is taking on water. There is a bilge pump under your seat. You will work it. The water cask is half full. The food will last 2 days, maybe 3 if we ration. We are somewhere in the channel, likely drifting east with the tide." The clinical, dispassionate listing of their dire circumstances was somehow more frightening than panic would have been. What is the plan?" Alistair asked, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar to his own ears. Sterling's gaze was unwavering. "The plan is to not be found. The cutter will have called every ship in the area to hunt for us. They will be searching the fog with listening glasses, hoping to hear our oars. So we wait. We drift. We be silent. And we pray this fog holds." He gestured to the pump, and Alistair, his muscles protesting, began the tedious, back-breaking work of pumping the seepage from the bottom of the boat, a slow, Sisyphean task that offered a grim focus for his terror. And as he pumped, the silence and the fog pressing in on them, a new, more insidious fear began to take root in his mind, the fear of Sterling himself. The man's preternatural calm, his lethal efficiency, his seemingly limitless bag of tricks and deceptions, it all pointed to a life lived so far outside the boundaries of normalcy that Alistair could no longer pretend to understand his motives. The story of the third party interested in balance now seemed naive, a fairy tale told to a child. A man like Sterling did not work for vague ideals. He worked for power, or money, or some deep, personal vendetta that Alistair could not fathom. What was to stop him from deciding that Alistair, the weak, terrified clerk, had become a liability? That the letter would be easier to deliver without him? The fog provided the perfect cover for a murder. A quick knife thrust, a body pushed overboard, swallowed by the grey silence without a trace. He would be just another casualty of a war that hadn't even officially begun. Alistair's pumping became more frantic, his eyes darting towards the long, wicked-looking knife sheath at Sterling's belt. He was trapped in a tiny boat with a master assassin, adrift in a void, and his only value was the document he carried. The paranoia became a physical taste in his mouth, metallic and sour. He found himself memorizing Sterling's movements, the way he held his head, the rhythm of his breathing, searching for any sign of the impending betrayal he was now certain was coming. The hours stretched on, an endless, grey purgatory. They took tiny, measured sips of water and bites of the rock-hard tack. Sterling occasionally stood, balancing effortlessly in the rocking boat, straining his ears for any sound of pursuit, but there was nothing, only the immense, echoing silence of the fog. It was during one of these moments that a sound did finally reach them, not the sound of a ship, but a deep, mournful, resonant booming, like a giant striking a drum underwater, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very hull of the boat. Sterling's head snapped around, his eyes wide with an emotion Alistair had never seen in them before, not fear, but a sharp, intense recognition. "The bell," he whispered, a look of almost reverent awe on his face. "The Garmin bell." Alistair stared at him. "A bell? What is it?" Sterling pointed into the impenetrable whiteness. "A navigation buoy. A giant bell anchored to a rock. It rings with the motion of the waves. It's a warning to ships to stay away from the Garmin shoals, a treacherous, half-submerged reef that has torn the bottoms out of 100 vessels." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Sterling's face, the first genuine expression Alistair had seen from him, and it was more frightening than any scowl. "It is also a marker. A signpost. I know where we are now. And I know where we are going." He seized the oars again, a new energy in his movements, and began to row, not randomly, but with a renewed purpose, following the deep, rhythmic, ghostly tolling of the bell, which grew louder and more distinct as they moved towards it, and soon, other sounds joined it. The louder crash of waves breaking on something solid, the hiss of water retreating over rock, and the fog began to thin slightly, revealing dark, jagged shapes looming out of the gloom, the dreaded shoals themselves, a labyrinth of sharp granite teeth waiting just below the surface, and Sterling navigated them with an expert's knowledge, twisting and turning the small boat through narrow, foaming channels that seemed to lead to certain destruction, until finally, he rowed into a surprisingly calm, sheltered cove hidden within the heart of the reef, and there, anchored in the still, black water, was a ship, but unlike any ship Alistair had ever seen. It was small, sleek, and low to the water, its hull painted a strange, mottled gray-green that made it almost invisible against the rock, its sails furled, its lines clean and predatory, a vessel built for stealth and speed, not for trade or war, and on its deck, a single figure stood, a tall, slender man dressed in dark clothing, holding a lantern that cast a feeble yellow glow, and as their longboat drew alongside, the man lowered the lantern, and Alistair saw his face, sharp, intelligent features, eyes that missed nothing, and a calm, waiting expression that mirrored Sterling's own unnerving composure. Sterling looked at Alistair, the dangerous smile still playing on his lips. "Welcome to the Rio Third Party, Mr. Finch. Our ride to America is here." The man on the deck spoke, his voice cultured, quiet, and laced with a faint French accent. "Monsieur Sterling, you are late. And you bring a guest. The weather, it has been most eventful, no?" Sterling handed the man the line from the longboat. "Events were unavoidable, Lafitte. This is the package. Is everything prepared?" The man, Lafitte, nodded, his eyes appraising Alistair with a cool, detached curiosity. "But of course. The Eclair is ready to fly. But we must depart immediately. The British, they are very angry. They are turning the channel upside down looking for a ghost." He extended a hand to help Alistair aboard the strange ship. "Come, monsieur. Your journey across the ocean will be somewhat more comfortable than your journey across the channel." Alistair, his mind reeling from this latest, unbelievable twist, climbed aboard, his feet landing on the solid, steady deck of the Eclair, and as he looked back at the tiny, leaking longboat that had been their precarious salvation, and at the terrifying, enigmatic figure of Mr. Sterling, he understood that he had just passed from one level of the game to another, and that the rules, the players, and the stakes had just changed once again, becoming even more mysterious and impossibly high. The transition from the leaking, precarious shell of the longboat to the solid, purposeful deck of the Eclair was not merely a change of vessel. It was a passage into a new and even more enigmatic stratum of the shadow war that had engulfed his life. A world of such refined, silent efficiency that it made the brutal chaos of the sandpiper and the stolen sparrowhawk seem like amateur theatrics. For this ship was a masterpiece of clandestine design, every line and fitting serving the singular purpose of invisibility and speed, its strange, mottled hull seeming to absorb the faint light rather than reflect it, its decks uncluttered and its rigging a complex, minimalist web designed for a skeleton crew to handle with silent, rapid precision. And the man who welcomed them, Lafitte, moved with a panther-like grace that was different from Sterling's lethal precision. It was the grace of a conductor. A man who commanded not through overt threat but through an aura of impeccable, unshakable competence, his French accent a soft, cultured whisper that somehow carried authority in every syllable, and his eyes, as they took in the bedraggled, terrified form of Alastair Finch, held not contempt or suspicion, but a deep, analytical curiosity, as if he were examining a fascinating and unexpected variable in a complex equation, and with a few quiet, murmured commands in French to his crew, a handful of grim, silent men who appeared from the shadows and began securing the longboat and preparing the Eclair for immediate departure. He led them below decks into a cabin that was the antithesis of every other space Alastair had been forced to inhabit since this nightmare began. It was small, yes, but it was clean, warm, and dry, lined with polished wood, a secure table bolted to the floor, a comfortable bunk with a real mattress, and even a small, gimbaled oil lamp that cast a steady, golden light. A haven of shocking normalcy in the midst of the surrounding madness. And Lafitte gestured for them to sit, producing a bottle of dark brandy and 3 glasses from a locked cabinet, pouring a measure for each of them with a steady hand, the rich aroma of the spirits a stark contrast to the smells of bilge, blood, and fear that had been Alastair's constant companions. "You will forgive the lack of ceremony," Lafitte said, handing a glass to Alastair, who took it with trembling fingers. "But circumstances demand efficiency. Monsieur Sterling, your message said you were bringing a document. A transformative document. I assume the turbulence of your journey has not compromised it." Sterling, who had finally allowed a sliver of fatigue to show now that they were in this secure space, downed his brandy in one swift motion and shook his head, his eyes sharp. "The document is secure. Finch has it. But the situation has escalated far beyond the document. The Crown knows my name. They know about the insurance. The Sparrowhawk was a temporary solution that has now made us the most wanted men in the British Empire. Our margin for error is gone." Lafitte's eyebrows rose slightly, but he showed no other sign of alarm. "The Sparrowhawk? You were forced to acquire a naval asset? Intriguing. And the insurance, is she still viable?" "She." The word hit Alastair like a physical blow. The other matter, the person of high-value interest from the dispatch, was a woman. Sterling gave a tight, grim nod. "She is. Or she was, when we left the Sandpiper. Briggs knew the protocol. If captured, she is to reveal herself as Lady Arabella Wortham, daughter of the Duke of Cumberland, and claim she was taken hostage by the traitor Finch to ensure his safe passage. It should create enough confusion and diplomatic panic to slow any execution. But if Briggs talked, or if the Navy already knew she was aboard, her value as a distraction evaporates, and she becomes just another hostage in a failed operation." Alastair's mind raced, trying to process this new layer of breathtaking complexity. Sterling hadn't just stolen a letter. He had apparently kidnapped a duke's daughter as a bargaining chip. The moral landscape of his desperate mission, which had once seemed so clear, a brave clerk trying to prevent a war, was now murky, stained with the shades of kidnapping and what sounded like cold-blooded manipulation of a young woman's life. You took a hostage?" Alastair whispered, the brandy tasting like ash in his mouth. "A duke's daughter?" Sterling turned his cold gaze on him. "I secured leverage, Finch. In the game we are playing, principles are a luxury we cannot afford. Lady Arabella is a known sympathizer to the colonial cause. She has written pamphlets, attended salons. Her disappearance, linked to a stolen document of peace, creates a political crisis that works in our favor. It divides attention. It makes the government look both tyrannical and incompetent. It is not pretty, but it is effective." Lafitte nodded slowly, pouring himself another brandy. "The logic is sound, if brutal. But it does complicate our passage. The entire British Navy will be blockading the Channel exits. The usual routes are closed to us." He unrolled a chart on the table, its edges worn from use. "We cannot go south to the Atlantic. We cannot go north around Scotland. It is too long, and the season is wrong. So we will go the way they will least expect." His long, elegant finger traced a path that made Alastair's blood run cold. It went east through the narrow Strait of Dover, the most heavily fortified and watched stretch of water in the world, past the guns of Dover Castle and the French forts at Calais, and then north, skirting the coast of the Netherlands and Denmark, all the way up and around through the treacherous, ice-choked waters of the Norwegian Sea, a journey of insane distance and peril. "You are mad," Alistair breathed, staring at the chart. "They will see us! They will sink us!" Lafitte's smile was thin and devoid of humor. "The Eclair is not the Sparrowhawk, monsieur. She is not built to be seen. She is built to be a ghost. We will travel by night. We will hide by day in coves and inlets. We will use the fog and the rain. And we have other advantages." He did not elaborate, but the certainty in his voice was absolute. Sterling looked at the chart, then at Lafitte, and gave a single, curt nod of agreement. The madness was decided. The plan was set. Lafitte then turned his full attention to Alistair, his gaze intense. "Now, Monsieur Finch. The document. If you please." It was not a request. It was a command. Alistair's hand went instinctively to the pouch beneath his shirt, his heart hammering. He looked at Sterling, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. With trembling fingers he untied the thong and pulled out the leather pouch, placing it on the table between them. Lafitte did not snatch it up. He examined it with the reverence of a scholar, noting the blank wax seal, the quality of the leather. Then, with exquisite care, he broke the seal and extracted the single, fateful sheet of parchment. He read it slowly, his eyes moving back and forth, and as he read, his expression changed from one of professional assessment to one of genuine, profound astonishment. He read it a second time, then looked up, first at Sterling, then at Alistair, his face pale. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, the words filled with a kind of holy dread. "It is real. It is all real. The apology, the concessions, the offer of full representation." He looked at Sterling, his voice shaking slightly. "This is not a political trick. This is a genuine offer. If this had reached Congress 6 months ago, it would have stopped the revolution in its tracks." Sterling finished, his voice flat. "And that is why they could never let it be sent. And that is why we must get it there now." At that moment, a quiet knock came at the cabin door, and one of the crew entered, murmuring something in rapid French to Lafitte, who listened, his face grave, then nodded. "It seems the hunt has begun in earnest," he said, turning back to them. "A full squadron of cutters is sweeping the channel mouth. We must submerge." Submerge? The word made no sense to Alistair. But Lafitte and Sterling were already moving, and he was ushered back onto the deck, where the crew was performing a bizarre ritual, battening down every hatch, closing every vent, securing everything with an airtight finality, and then several of the men began turning large, geared wheels set into the deck amidships, and with a series of deep, groaning clicks, Alistair watched in utter, dumbfounded disbelief as the sides of the Eclair began to lower. Long, articulated panels of the same mottled material extended outward from the hull, meeting in the middle to form a continuous, sealed deck over the entire vessel, and the mast, with its complex rigging, was being retracted into a housing, disappearing from view, and within minutes, the sleek ship was gone, replaced by a low, strange, cigar-shaped object that sat low in the water, and then, with a hiss of releasing air, the entire contraption began to sink, water washing over the deck then the viewing ports, then rising up over the top, and Alistair, his mind shattering with the impossibility of what was happening, realized they were not on a ship at all. They were on a submersible boat, a machine that could travel beneath the waves, a thing of legend and whispered rumor, and as the water closed over their heads and the world outside the thick glass portholes became a dim, green, silent universe of drifting seaweed and curious fish, the only sound the low hum of some hidden mechanism and the frantic beating of his own heart, Alistair understood that he was not just involved in a game of spies and secrets. He was a passenger on a vessel of the future, caught in a war for the world, and the depths of the ocean were now the only place left to hide. The world outside the thick, reinforced glass of the porthole was a realm of utter, suffocating alienness, a dim, green-hued twilight where light filtered down in weak, shimmering shafts from a surface that seemed a million miles away, a silent, weightless world of drifting particulate matter and strangely curious fish that would appear suddenly from the gloom to peer in with blank, uncomprehending eyes before vanishing back into the endless, dark blue void, and the interior of the submersible. Vessel Eclair was a claustrophobic's worst nightmare made real, a pressurized metal tube that smelled of oil, cold sweat, and the tang of recycled air, the only sounds the constant, low, vibrating hum of a mysterious engine deep within the hull and the occasional, unsettling creak of metal protesting the immense, crushing pressure of the ocean depths. A sound that sent jolts of primal terror through Alastair Finch every time it echoed through the cramped space, and he sat strapped into a secured seat, his body trembling not from cold, though the air was chill, but from the sheer, overwhelming psychological shock of his situation. He was traveling underneath the sea, in a machine he could not have conceived of in his wildest dreams, a feat of engineering that seemed to belong to the pages of a fantastical novel, not to the grim, real-world struggle of espionage and revolution, and across from him, Mr. Sterling and the Frenchman, Lafitte, were engaged in a quiet, intense conversation, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of dials and gauges on a central panel, speaking in a low technical shorthand about pressure differentials, ballast tanks, and electrical carbon piles. Their calm, professional demeanor in the face of this marvelous stark, terrifying contrast to Alastair's own petrified disbelief, and he clutched the arms of his seat, his knuckles white, every instinct screaming that this metal coffin was going to fail, that at any moment the seams would burst and the entire, unimaginable weight of the ocean would explode inward to crush them into nothingness, and the leather pouch containing the letter felt like it was burning a hole against his chest, its historic significance now dwarfed by the terrifying, futuristic reality of its delivery system, and after what felt like an eternity of this submerged, nerve-shredding travel. Lafitte consulted a complex chronometer and a series of wavering needles on the brass-faced instruments, and nodded to Sterling. "We are beyond the immediate search grid. We can surface to replenish the air and get a celestial fix. But quickly." He gave a series of quiet orders in French to one of his crewmen, who began turning a large wheel, and Alastair felt a change in the vessel's motion, a subtle shift in angle, and then the sound of pumps engaging, loud and mechanical in the confined space, and through the porthole, he saw the green gloom begin to lighten, the water outside turning from midnight blue to a lighter aqua, and then, with a great surge and a crashing sound that was shockingly loud after the deep silence, the Eclair broke the surface, the articulated deck panels retracting with a series of hydraulic hisses, allowing the cold, fresh, night air to flood into the cabin, air that tasted sweeter than any brandy, and Alastair gasped it in, his lungs aching, as he stumbled up the steep ladder after Sterling and onto the now open deck, where the sight that greeted him stole what little breath he had left. They were completely alone on a vast, black, placid sea under a canopy of stars so brilliant and countless they seemed to press down upon the world, the moon a sharp, silver sliver casting a shimmering path across the water, the silence absolute and profound, the coast of England nowhere to be seen, and for a moment, the sheer, awesome beauty of it all overwhelmed the fear, offering a fleeting, terrifying peace. But Lafitte and his crew were already at work, no time for all, unfurling a strange, collapsible mast and a dark sail, while another man set up a complex sextant to take sightings from the stars. His movements swift and precise, and Sterling stood at the rail, his spyglass again scanning the empty horizon, his body tense, ever vigilant, and it was then, in that immense, silent emptiness, that the question which had been burning in Alastair's mind since the cabin finally broke free, his voice a hoarse croak. "How? How is this possible? This machine?" Sterling lowered the glass, his profile etched in starlight. "Science, Finch. Not magic. An American, David Bushnell, calls it a turtle. A one-man vessel. Lafitte and his patrons have improved upon the design. They see its potential. A way to challenge British naval supremacy not with bigger ships, but with invisible ones." His tone was matter-of-fact, but the implications were world-ending. "The French, they are helping us?" Alastair asked, confused, the political alliances a tangled web he could not unravel. Sterling's smile was thin and cold. "The French are helping themselves. They see a chance to weaken their ancient enemy. They do not care about American liberty. They care about British defeat. We are all using each other, Finch. Remember that. Lafitte, overhearing, gave a graceful shrug without looking up from his charts. Monsieur, it is geopolitics. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, for now. This document you carry, it is the key. If it can prevent a war, it denies Britain a long, costly conflict that would bleed her dry. If it cannot, and war comes, it will prove to the world that the British Crown refused a just peace, bringing other sympathizers to the American cause. It is a win-win proposition for France. For you, however, the stakes are somewhat more personal. The cynicism of it, the cold, calculating realpolitik that treated nations and lives as pieces on a board, made Alistair feel sick. He was a pawn not just of Sterling, but of entire governments playing a game of empires. The noble cause of peace felt tainted, soiled by these dark, hidden machinations. The crewman with the sextant murmured something to Lafitte, who nodded and made a notation on his chart. We are further north than I hoped. The currents are strong. We must submerge again at dawn. The navigation will be delicate. We are entering the narrower waters. For the next 5 days they fell into a bizarre, grueling routine, traveling submerged during the daylight hours, a time of nerve-wracking tension and claustrophobic dread in the humming, creaking metal tube, surrounded by the terrifying pressure of the deep, then surfacing at night to sail like a conventional, if strange-looking, vessel, using the stars to guide them, always watching, always listening for the sound of another ship. The sight of a sail on the horizon, and during these nights, Alistair learned more about the incredible machine he was on. It was powered by a hand-cranked propeller when submerged and by sail on the surface. The air was replenished by a clever system of snorkels and bellows, and its existence was one of the most closely guarded secrets in Europe, a secret that Lafitte's mysterious patrons, who he guessed were high-level officials within the French government, were risking everything to deploy. And the stress was immense, the fear constant, but it was. During the third night, as they surfaced into a thick, foggy darkness, that the fear became reality. They had just raised the sail when a sound echoed across the water, the distinct, rhythmic splash of oars, and then the ghostly outline of a longship emerged from the mist, a Viking raider with a dragon-headed prow, its deck filled with hulking, shadowy figures. And for a heart-stopping moment, Alistair thought he had traveled back in time, but Lafitte cursed viciously in French. Les frères de la côte! Pirates! Sterling had his pistol and cutlass out in an instant, his face a mask of cold fury. They hunt these fog banks for easy prey. The pirate ship drew alongside with shocking speed, grappling hooks studding into the Eclair's rail, and a dozen rough, armed men swarmed aboard, their faces scarred and brutal in the lantern light. Their leader, a giant with a gold ring in his nose, grinning a toothless grin at Lafitte. A pretty little ghost ship, he growled in a thick accent. What secrets does it hold? And what treasure? A fight ensued, short, brutal, and desperate. Sterling and Lafitte fought like demons, back to back, their skills complementary, Sterling's lethal efficiency meeting Lafitte's fluid, fencing grace, and even the crew joined in with pistols and knives, but the pirates were too many, and just as it seemed they would be overwhelmed, Alistair, backed into a corner, terrified out of his mind, did the only thing he could think of. He reached into the pouch, not to destroy the letter, but to use it. He pulled out the crisp parchment, holding it up in the foggy light, and shouted at the pirate leader, his voice cracking with fear. Wait! This is what you want! It's a royal pardon! A full pardon from King George for any pirate who aids His Majesty's cause. Sealed by the Earl of Dartmouth himself. It's worth more than gold. The pirate chief froze, his men hesitating. He stepped forward, snatching the letter from Alistair's hand, his crude fingers smudging the elegant script. He squinted at it, unable to read, but recognizing the official seal and the quality of the parchment. He looked from the letter to Alistair's terrified face, to the still fighting Sterling and Lafitte, a war of greed and suspicion raging behind his eyes. The lie was so audacious, so perfectly tailored to a pirate's deepest desire, legitimacy, freedom from the noose, that it held him spellbound. It was a gamble of insane proportions, and for a moment, the entire battle hung in the balance, the only sound the heavy breathing of the combatants, and the lap of water against the hull. The pirate chief's eyes narrowed, the valuable parchment clutched in his fist, the promise of a king's pardon warring with the immediate lure of plunder. The fate of the mission now hinged on the greed of a cutthroat. The silence that descended upon the deck of the Eclair was more terrifying than the clash of steel and the shouts of battle had been, a thick, palpable tension strung taut between the desperate, bloody defenders and the hulking, hesitant pirates, all eyes locked on their leader, the giant with the gold nose ring, who stood frozen, his brutish face a mask of conflicting emotions. Avarice, suspicion, and a desperate, hungry hope, as he clutched the crisp, official-looking parchment that promised a freedom he had long since resigned himself to never attaining, the elegant script and imposing seal speaking a language of power and legitimacy that even an illiterate cutthroat could understand. And in that endless, heart-stopping moment, Alistair Finch, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, waited for the decision that would mean either a miraculous reprieve or a swift and brutal death. The audacity of his lie now hanging in the foggy air like a spectre, and he could see the calculations going on behind the pirate chief's eyes, weighing the tangible, immediate loot of a strange ship against the intangible, life-changing promise of a king's pardon, a promise delivered by a terrified, bedraggled man who didn't look like any royal envoy he'd ever seen. And just as the chief's expression began to harden back into predatory greed, Mr. Sterling, sensing the critical juncture, played his own card with flawless timing, lowering his bloodied cutlass and stepping forward, his voice dropping into the low, commanding, aristocratic register he had used to bluff the naval frigate, every inch the royal official. "The boy speaks the truth," he declared, his tone dripping with bored authority, as if dealing with pirates was a mere administrative inconvenience. "I am Sir William Pettigrew, special envoy to the Earl of Dartmouth. That document is genuine. His Majesty is consolidating his assets in the Channel. Loyal service will be rewarded. Interference will be met with the full wrath of the Admiralty. You have a choice to make, Captain. A short life of hanging in oblivion, or a long life of peace and property." The use of a name, a title, and the specific mention of the Earl solidified the fiction, layering Alistair's desperate gamble with a veneer of official credibility. The pirate chief's eyes darted from Sterling's imperious face to the letter in his hand, and the desire for legitimacy, for a way out of his brutal, short existence, finally won over. He grunted, a low, rumbling sound, and shoved the precious letter inside his own filthy tunic. "We'll take the pardon," he growled, pointing a thick, callous finger at Sterling. "But if this is a trick, I will personally feed your guts to the gulls." He barked an order to his men in a guttural tongue, and the pirates, though clearly disappointed, began to retreat, pulling their grappling hooks free and clambering back onto their own sinister longship, which melted back into the fog from whence it came as silently as a ghost, leaving the crew of the Eclair standing amidst the wreckage of the brief fight, breathing heavily, streaked with blood and sweat, the sudden silence ringing in their ears. Lafitte was the first to move, rushing to Alistair, not with anger, but with a look of stunned admiration. "Incroyable!" he breathed. "A bluff of magnificent audacity! You risked the entire world on the greed of a pirate!" Sterling's reaction was different. He grabbed Alistair by the front of his shirt, his face a cold mask of fury, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "You fool! You imbecile! You handed it to him! You gave the most important document in the world to a filthy pirate!" Alistair, still shaking from adrenaline, stammered. I had to. It was the only thing I could think of. It worked, didn't it? It worked this time." Sterling snarled, shoving him away in disgust. "You gambled everything on a random throw of the dice. What if he could read? What if he'd just taken it and killed us anyway? The mission would be over. We are not playing a game, Finch. We are conducting an operation. There are rules. There is control. What you did was reckless and stupid." The condemnation was brutal, and it crushed the brief spark of pride Alistair had felt. He had saved them, but in the eyes of the professional, he had sinned against the sacred tenets of the craft. Lafitte, however, interceded, placing a calming hand on Sterling's arm. "Assez, Michel." He acted. In the moment, he found a solution. It was not your way, but it was a way. And we are alive, and the document, I assume, will find its way to the bottom of the sea once that brute discovers it will not buy him ale in a tavern. Sterling shook off his hand, but the cold rage remained in his eyes. He turned his back on Alistair, a dismissal more complete than any blow. Get us submerged. Now. Before something else finds us in this damned fog. The next few days of the journey were icy. Sterling did not speak a single word to Alistair, treating him as if he were merely another piece of inconvenient cargo. The atmosphere inside the submersible was thick with a new kind of tension, the hum of the engine now a soundtrack to Alistair's shame and isolation. He had ventured a move on the board, and the master player had found it contemptible. They continued their routine of traveling by deep, hidden paths during the day and surfacing at night, the landscape outside the portholes changing from the open sea to the treacherous, rocky coastlines of the Low Countries and then the dramatic, fjord-carved shores of Norway, the water growing colder, the air sharper, the nights longer, and the navigational challenges increasing exponentially, requiring all of Lafitte's skill and concentration to avoid the countless unseen hazards beneath the surface. It was during one of these tense, silent daylight submersions, as they crept through the icy, deep waters off the Norwegian coast, that a new sound began, a low, persistent, grinding screech of metal on rock that set everyone's teeth on edge. Lafitte's face went pale. "Nod," he whispered, his hands flying over the controls. "The current, it has pushed us off the charted path. We are dragging against an underwater ridge." The sound grew louder, more violent, a horrifying screech that vibrated through the entire hull, and then came a sickening, wrenching crunch, and the Eclair lurched violently to a stop, tilted at a steep angle, throwing everyone against their restraints. The hum of the engine died, replaced by an ominous, hissing sound. A red light began to flash on the control panel. "Breach!" one of the crewmen yelled in French, pointing to a seam in the hull near the stern where a jet of freezing seawater was already spraying into the cabin. Panic erupted, controlled but desperate. Lafitte was shouting orders, trying to activate pumps to reverse the engines, but the vessel was stuck fast, impaled on a hidden spike of rock, the icy water of the Norwegian Sea pouring in. Sterling was already moving, grabbing emergency kits, his earlier fury replaced by the cold focus of survival. "Abandon ship! To the